Tensions in the Middle East have escalated dramatically with the ongoing Iran-Israel conflict now involving US strikes and retaliatory actions. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that carries nearly one-third of the world's seaborne oil, faces severe disruption. Hundreds of tankers are jammed or anchored, and flows have plummeted for India, which imports over 85% of its crude oil and relies heavily on Middle Eastern supplies passing through this choke point. The big question now is, do we have enough oil in reserve if supplies dry up? Is India the most vulnerable to prolonged oil supply shocks in wake of the ongoing Middle East tensions post the Israel-US strikes on Iran and the latter's retaliation as well? Well, hello and welcome. You're watching Deep Dive. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. As the US-Israel war in Iran is getting into its stride, India is calculating its oil reserves in case of a possible crisis. First, why does the Strait of Hormuz matter so much? Well, this 33-kilometer wide passage connects the Persian Gulf to the in fact open Arabian Sea every day. Around 15 to 20 million barrels of oil flow through it, about 20% of global consumption as well. For India, over 50% of our crude imports, that's roughly 2.5 to 2.7 million barrels per day, come from countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Kuwait. Remember, these all transit Hormuz. That's half of our total crude imports of more than 5 million barrels daily. India is the world's fastest growing major economy and, of course, also a fast growing consumer of oil. Its vulnerability to supply shocks stems from the relatively small reserves in strategic oil reserves. This is especially much lower than its neighbor China, which has a 6-month buffer in case of continuing disruptions. Nearly 90% of Middle Eastern oil exports are destined for Asia. Japan and South Korea rely even more heavily on the region, sourcing about 95% and 70% of their oil respectively. However, both countries maintain far larger reserve buffers than India and China. Japan's oil stockpiles are sufficient for around 254 days of consumption, while a South Korean government official has said the country's reserves can cover roughly 208 days. Both India and China are big consumers of oil from the Middle East. In fact, around 50% of India's crude imports make their way through the Strait of Hormuz. India's dependence on oil from the Middle East and transiting through the Strait of Hormuz has also gone up in the last few months after it reduced crude oil procurement from Russia. The vulnerability facing these major Asian economies highlights the widespread fallout from the Israel and US strikes on Iran, which have escalated into a broader regional confrontation and shut down the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage is a critical choke point, handling about 1/5 of global oil shipments. India holds about 100 million barrels of commercial crude oil stocks in storage tanks, underground strategic reserves, and also on ships voyaging towards the country, which could cover roughly 40 to 45 days of its requirement if flows through the Strait of Hormuz are disrupted, according to KPLER. Now, India imports about 88% of our crude oil needs, the raw material for fuel such as petrol and diesel, with more than 50% supplied by Middle Eastern countries and transiting the narrow Strait of Hormuz, flows from which have been disrupted amidst the Iran crisis. If Middle Eastern crude supply were to halt completely for a temporary period, the immediate impact would be logistical and price-driven, with supply risks intensifying if movement through the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted for longer. With imports via the Strait of Hormuz averaging about 2.5 million barrels per day, about half of India's just over 5 million BPD total crude imports, these combined reserves could theoretically cover around 40 to 45 days of imports in a crude disruption scenario. A closure of the Strait of Hormuz would first impact prompt cargo liftings. However, refiners typically maintain commercial inventories, and cargoes already on water would continue to arrive, providing some short-term cushioning to the system. In the event of a prolonged disruption, medium-term pressures would build through higher import costs, freight exposure, and the need to reroute supplies over longer distances. The country maintains strategic petroleum reserves alongside commercial inventories held by refiners and oil marketing companies. These buffers are intended to manage temporary supply shocks rather than sustained outages. Based on KPLER inventory data, commercial crude stocks are around 100 million barrels, including volumes in the strategic petroleum reserve facilities at Mangalore, Padur and Visakhapatnam. Additional refined product inventories would extend effective coverage further. However, the immediate impact will be on prices. Brent global benchmark crossed $80 per barrel, roughly 10% more since the Iran crisis. For India, higher prices means higher import bill. India spent $137 billion on crude oil imports in the fiscal year ended 31st of March 2025. During April 2025 to January 2026, first 10 months of the current fiscal, it spent $100.4 billion on import of 206.3 million tons of crude oil. India, the world's third largest oil importer, imports roughly half of its crude needs through the narrow strait. Its mainstay liquefied natural gas supply in Qatar also uses the strait to ship the fuel to India. In case of closure, India can tap suppliers in West Africa, Latin America and the US to make up for the shortfall from the Middle East. India could also tap Russian oil to make up for the deficit. India had agreed to wind down purchases of Russian oil as part of a trade deal with the US, a deal which now sits in limbo after the US Supreme Court struck down US President Trump's country-based tariffs. If the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow 33-kilometer passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, were disrupted or shipping were forced onto longer routes, India's crude import bill would rise. Even without a full blockade, higher freight, war risk insurance and geopolitical premiums would lift landed costs. Given that India is amongst the world's largest exporters of refined products, particularly diesel and jet, redirecting export volumes to the domestic market would provide an additional buffer. The worst case scenario would involve a prolonged and severe disruption to Hormuz flows combined with sustained geopolitical escalation. In that case, crude prices would spike sharply, freight markets would also tighten, and refineries could eventually be forced to trim runs if replacement barrels are delayed. However, such a scenario would have global economic consequences, in fact major ones, making it a low probability but high impact risk. India has diversification options and inventory buffers, but sustained disruption would materially increase the import bill and create macroeconomic pressures. Major global shipping lines have suspended transits through the waterway, and on Sunday an oil tanker sailing near Oman faced missile attacks. Officials though said India is unlikely to face any near-term disruption in oil supplies from the closure. Early in February, Petroleum Minister Hardeep Singh Puri had told Rajya Sabha that India's strategic petroleum reserve can last 74 days to meet the demand arising out of any global turbulence. As of January, India was importing approximately 2.74 million barrels per day from the Middle East, which is around 55% of its total crude purchases. That share marks the highest level since late 2022, after Indian refineries scaled back Russian oil intake amidst pressure from Washington. If the Strait of Hormuz shuts down fully, India's commercial crude buffer gives us about 40 to 45 days of critical imports, while total stocks extend to around 74 days. That's a decent shield against short-term chaos, but a prolonged crisis would certainly test our diversification and economy hard, especially compared to better buffered neighbors like China. Dr. Sharad Kohli, senior economist, in fact, now joins us live. Dr. Kohli, the Strait of Hormuz, of course, is closed currently. What's going to be the impact of a prolonged closure on oil supplies for India and, of course, also for the rest of the world?
Good evening, Uday, to you and the viewers. I must put on record my appreciation for the brilliant work done by your production team in digging out these facts and figures. They indeed give a very, very clear picture. But just to take it beyond that and study the economic impact of if this situation arises, where the war gets prolonged and we are, for example, unable to import anything Strait of Hormuz, through Strait of Hormuz for that matter. We still have the other half, Uday, which will be coming to us. But we should keep in mind two aspects. One, the crude prices would have already gone up. They're already up and they might go up further. Second, the cost of transportation import will go up because we'll have to take a longer route. Well, I'm sure people by now know that Strait of Hormuz, which has so much been in the news, is a shortcut. Basically, it reduces the time and the travel freight, shall I say, the shipping freight. So I think if this shuts down, we will have to take a longer route. The insurance cost goes up, the shipping line cost goes up, and it takes longer time as well. So if we dig into the other half, which is if the other 50%, plus we may have to import instead of Brent, we may have to import the WTI category. Now this WTI category can be refined at Jamnagar refinery, which is very much capable, but here the output is low. That is harder crude. And it is called the Western Texas Intermediate. That's the American type crude. If we get it from Venezuela or from any other place, it may not necessarily be Brent. So the output is going to low. That will further enhance the cost. So we can be in a situation where we may have to be importing, more expensive one. We may have to be importing a delayed delivery. we may have to be also facing shortages. So consider a situation, although it's all speculative as of now, because nobody knows how long this war is going to be prolonged for, because there are miscellaneous mixed kind of statements coming out from America, from Iran, from Israel. This can get dragged on to 4 weeks, 4 to 5. It could be anything. It's all very, very speculative. But assuming a situation where we are facing a crunch, we'll have to be prepared for the crude oil prices per barrel going up to $95 to $100. So I feel the moment it crosses a psychological barrier of $100, we can look forward to a petrol diesel price increase, which would mean a cascading inflationary impact on the country. Well, fortunately, we are in a very sweet spot as far as inflation is concerned, just about little over 2% within the range of the RBI. But I think people should be prepared for beyond control reasons which can come our way in the times to come, Uday.
Absolutely. Also, Dr. Kohli, this is going to be the short-term impact. What about the long-term impact? If the conflict does stretch on, how will India, look at alternative options as well? How long will our buffer stocks last? Can we look at alternative impacts? Also, what kind of impact is this going to have on our economy, on our GDP? As you're saying, inflation will go up, obviously, if prices rise. But how much of an economic impact should we be ready for if this conflict gets more prolonged?
Well, if we take the statement from Minister Hardeep Puri, he says we've got reserves of about 70, it's about 2.5 months, 74 days. But every $10 price rise of crude takes our inflation or CPI up by 30 to 40 basis points. And every $10 rise in crude, or inflation for that matter, takes our impacts our GDP to the extent of 20 to 30 basis points. So if our GDP right now is 7.8%, we may have to take a hit and it'll come down to about 7.5%. So obviously it'll be a GDP hit. This is for every $10. So I think the inflationary impact has to be kept in mind. Our trade deficit will increase. Our foreign exchange reserves will start bleeding. We've got $700 billion plus of forex reserves, but they'll start bleeding sooner because our import bill is going to rise. 87% of our crude requirements are being imported at this point of time. So we'll probably have to look at shedding more of forex reserves in the times to come. So overall, the economic impact, obviously, the macroeconomic impact is not going to be very good. And plus, the worst thing which will happen, Uday, is that this has got a cascading and a rippling effect. Because the moment your transportation costs rise because of petrol, diesel, you find that your overall CPI, the consumer price index, goes up because all your essential items, they start increasing. And I think we'll have to be speeding up our pace of alternate fuels. That's one step we can take. And of course, I hope that doesn't happen. We can look at a time when rationing of petrol and diesel may start happening. If there is a shortage, it's not a question of price. It's a question of whether we have it or not. So I think we'll have to start digging into the alternate sources. I'm sure the government in its CCS, the Cabinet Committee of Security and Cabinet Committee of Economic Affairs, it must be already looking. There's a war room which has been set up, I am told, which is monitoring the situation day in, day out. Let's hope, wish and pray that the war settles down soon. Otherwise, I think the citizens of the country, anybody who is listening to me and you is watching you and me, I think should be looking at probably being more conservative on your petrol and diesel consumption, because your grocery bills, your overall household budget is going to get disturbed if the prices were to go up. But it is all speculative, as I said, Uday. We are all contemplating, we are discussing in advance that should that situation come, this is what you should be doing.
All right. Appreciate you joining us, Dr. Kohli, with your perspective on that segment.